this week, we're going to cover chapters 8 and 9 from Smith, as well as Mary Astle, which was a primary reading, and there were two versions of that primary reading, so make sure you read all of the announcement notes and you look over both, and then the Harriston chapter, as well as Knobloch and Cooper. So to begin with, we're going to start with Smith chapter 8. So what we see with Smith chapter 8 is a series of rhetoricians who are talking about essentially how the mind functions. So Descartes is one of the most influential for this, because what he's looking at is where is the mind, because to him it doesn't seem like it could be inside of our bodies, and so he sees it as out. So we have the mind-body dualism. So then how does our body interact with our mind so that our body does what our mind tells it to do? And as we start conceptualizing the mind, and as we start running through the theorists, so we have Vico and we have Bacon and we have Locke, what we're dealing with specifically with each of these is, what does language do to thinking, and what does language do for knowledge? How does it influence the construction of knowledge? How does it influence thinking? And then how do we put all of that together? So what we see with Vico specifically is a focus on language. What we see with Locke specifically is that, and his is the tabula rasa, which gets overturned very quickly, but he thinks that we're all a blank slate. So we come into this world with absolutely nothing, and then as we start to get older, we have to fill up all of that blankness. This tabula rasa is going to influence Jung later when he starts to talk about the collective unconscious, because he realizes that from the moment babies are born, we immediately start to teach them culture and to enculturate them. And so we can't ever have a moment of being a blank slate, because we're always surrounded by something. And even more modern research talks about how much a baby can hear in the womb and all of those kinds of things, which are influencing what is it that we know and how much do we know. After Locke, Smith talks about four Enlightenment speaking women. First, he starts off with Discovery, who focuses specifically on the idea of a salon. So a salon is a gathering of people that happen in a woman's home where the goal is conversation. And her, Discovery's goal, is if we can influence the men that come to this salon and we can prioritize women's issues within the salon space, we can approach them with conversation, we can approach them with very little emotion. We can use logic in this smaller space, and then our concerns and our needs can be addressed in a much broader issue because we've done it on this very, very small scale. Next, Smith talks about Cavendish, who wants to initiate social reforms in a very similar way. If we talk to men on small scales, how can we make women's issues more important? Next is Fell, who talks about rhetoric as a dialogue. So how do we engage in conversation? What order can we put conversation in? How can we understand that particular order so that our logic can come across and it can be meaningful to the people that are listening to us? And again, all four of these women are attempting to focus on men and how can we influence men to take our issues seriously. The fourth woman that Smith focuses on very heavily is Estelle, who we're going to talk about in just a minute. After we come out of the Enlightenment women, the next focus that we have is on the idea of faculty psychology. So now that we've realized we have this thing called the mind, how is it that ideas come to be? How is it that ideas come together? How is it that ideas are attracted to each other? How is it that we remember some things and not others? So again, for this chapter, I have extensive notes in the other Prezi, so make sure that you look at it. I'm just going to go through the ideas of faculty psychology really quickly. We have Hume, who focuses on the 5 aspects of faculty psychology. We have Campbell, who talks about how language is inadequate, so his is the box. If I have a box and inside the box I say every statement in this box is false, language does not help me come to any sort of truth. Language actually muddies all of the waters and it makes things a lot more difficult. Next, we have Blair with the idea of noble rhetoric. So what we're starting to get to in this particular case is, and you can see it here in the Prezi, is rhetoric focused on style and delivery only, or is rhetoric epistemological? Does rhetoric, does language, does knowledge, does the way that we use and understand, and our mind uses and understand language, does that help us make knowledge? And so the big question that ties all of these ideas together, especially, the early theorists of the mind, the enlightened women, and then later faculty psychology, is what we're trying to find out is, does our mind just know truth, or does language and culture influence truth? Does it influence knowing, and does it influence how we know? So if we get to a point where language and culture both influence what we know and how we know, then we can't get outside of language and culture, which means language and culture must be epistemological, and rhetoric must be the way that we make sense of the world, because it uses language, it uses culture, it uses our mind, and it puts all of these things together in how, basically our brain fires. That's what all of these theorists are looking at. Okay, so for this chapter, the next theorist that we focused on was Mary Estelle, and what we saw specifically with her is a focus on education for women, and her goal, and you saw this in the brief introduction about her, and then you also saw it in both pieces that we read by her, is that her goal is not to educate women for feminist purposes. Her goal is not for women to have a more active role in public life. Instead, her goal is to have more educated women who can then support the men who run, civic life and who run all of these active parts. And it's a way that if a woman is educated and she's taken seriously by her husband, then her issues and her problems and her concerns can also be addressed in civic affairs as they need to be. So her goal is to educate as many women as she can, and she sees a huge tie between community, Christianity, and truth. So for her, education can't come outside of the community. Education has to come together. This could be, and it's a really interesting read, because is this influenced by her position as a privileged female who then became not privileged because she didn't have any money, and so she was constantly relying on other people? These ties back to the community, especially the way that she's finding community ties through Christianity, could also be because she is a woman, and women at this time period did not have personhood, they were property. So if you're viewed as property and you want your issues to be taken seriously, you always have to be a part of everything else, because you can't ever have your own agency. And so then through this idea of community, through her understanding of Christianity and her valuing of Christian principles, she was finding truth. And she wanted to protect women, and she wanted to educate women, and she wanted to make female lives better. But again, not in a feminist way where it's girl power. Instead, it's in a way where we just want to make all of society better, all of society function better. But I don't think that women need to overthrow the tyrants, which was a principle that she was fighting against with Locke at the time. And there were a lot of other theorists who were on board with Locke, where if you educate the masses, then the masses are always going to overthrow the tyrant. Her goal was not to overthrow tyranny, especially husband tyranny. Instead, her goal was to make life better for those particular women. They can make better choices when they marry men. They can make better choices in relation to, how their fathers run their dowries and all of those kinds of things. How their fathers deal with money, so that if their fathers die prior to them being married, they have an idea of what to do with money and how to deal with money. So it's more a focus on what can we do to improve the lives of women, especially when they don't have personhood, and we're all okay with the idea that women don't have personhood. So in her particular case, rhetoric is more a style, and this is, both good and bad. So for her, rhetoric being a style means that rhetoric doesn't create new knowledge. All new knowledge and all truth come from God, and they come from Christianity, and they come from the church. The positive side of rhetoric for delivery with Estelle, and we don't see this as heavily with most of the men who see rhetoric as delivery at this time, so before we switch into rhetoric as epistemological, is that if rhetoric is just delivery, then that means that rhetoric in no way impedes the functioning of the mind, which means all women can learn. What we start to see, and what we see picking up from Locke and faculty psychology, is if our brains function in very specific ways, that means some of them function better than others. And so then the idea becomes, and again, we're picking all of this up still from Jesus's original teachings that Augustine taught with the four audiences. So when he breaks down the four audiences of believers with money and education, those that are educated that don't believe, the masses, and then children, each of these four is seen as being able to understand and comprehend in different ways. So we're picking that up again here and saying, if we keep rhetoric as style and delivery, then that means we don't need to account for these four audiences as differences in how they're capable of learning. Instead, we can focus on these audiences as how do we change our argument to appeal best to each of those four audiences, with the understanding that all women can equally learn. This is a really important principle, and it's going to be dropped again, and we see a lot of these ideas come out when the suffragettes start fighting in America for the right to vote, and when the abolitionists are fighting for the ending of slavery. The presumption is that because women have smaller brains physically, they're not as smart and they cannot be capable of the same level of intelligence. And then what we see with African Americans is because their skin is a different color, they're not capable of thinking at the same rational level. Estelle is focusing on rhetoric as delivery. How do you convince an audience that what you're saying is the truth? And then that makes the assumption that all women are capable of learning at the same level, because rhetoric is just a God-given talent. Not everybody has to have it, but everybody is capable of learning. And that's really important for Estelle and all of these principles. Next one that we focus on is Hairston, who is talking about the paradigm shift that we saw in composition and composition instruction. So initially, composition instruction has been a part of the English department since the founding of the early institutions here in America. So Harvard had composition courses mostly taught with Greek rhetors, and so everybody that we've read up to this point. But because they were focusing also on literature, the focus with how to teach composition and what to do in composition was mostly focused on product. So student goes out, they write their essay by themselves, and then they submit it, and then the instructor's job is to mark up all of the errors. And in that particular case, the focus became, how much time can I spend on this draft marking the grammar errors, as opposed to dealing with argument issues or supporting detail issues or audience understanding issues. When we focus on product, the result has a tendency to be grammar. We still see this particular product focus in most of the disciplines across the university, and we'll see this for the next discussion board. If we have a product that's submitted, then the only way to grade it is to mark it up, and students never learn then how to fix their grammar, and the disciplines wonder why. So Hairston instead is focusing on the idea of process. So as we shift this particular paradigm and we focus more heavily on composition and how is it that we conceptualize writing in our brains, so again, we're mixing in this particular process approach what we were learning about language, the cultural embeddedness of language in faculty psychology, how does our brain function to come to ideas, and how culturally situated do we need to be, which we're going to see picked up again later. So Hairston is focusing on the idea of process and the importance of process. If we focus with students on all of these various steps as part of the writing process, and we emphasize to them how much time they should be spending in pre-writing and how much cultural embeddedness, even though we don't use that terminology, how much cultural embeddedness they need to be aware of as they write. And again, we're starting to see Bartholomew, which we read very early in the semester, come back, where students really do invent the writing situation every time they sit down. And so Hairston's focus with process is, how do we do that in pre-writing, and how do we tell them so they can self-reflect on it so they can do it more effectively? So her big question is, as we're shifting this particular focus and the theory is heading towards process, what does that mean for the composition course and what should be done in the composition course? And she has a couple ideas for what to do that then need to be circulated and actually implemented within classrooms. The second half of this week, we're going to focus on Smith Chapter 9. And what Smith Chapter 9 is talking about is the paradigm shift, because we're big on paradigm shifts, between modernism and existentialism. So we cover a lot of modernists, and you guys are going to discuss these in much more detail in the discussion boards. And the overall focus of modernism is a focus on reason. So there's a clear divide between reason, which is a part of logic, and rhetoric as style and delivery. So we're back to the divide. Rhetoric is no longer epistemic. Rhetoric instead is simply style and delivery, and it's logic that we use to make our knowledge. So when Campbell talked about language being flawed, and that if we have our box and we put inside our box that every statement inside this box is false, and so now we're in this endless circle, the modernists ignore that particular part and say through reason and then the right language, it can always communicate the truth, and it can always communicate through logic. The existentialists pick up on that and they say, well, the problem is once you start heading down that path of reason, how do you get out of the endless cycle of reason? The existentialists are some of my favorite philosophers, and especially rhetorical philosophers for that particular reason, is they really, really want to ask all of the good questions. The problem with the existentialism is they get to the point where they're like, we're mired in decision, we can't do anything. And so then they don't. They just ask more questions and say, yay, endless questions, that's the answer to everything. But overall, their focus on questions and their focus on the meaning to life and their focus on where is it that we exist and why do we exist and how do all of these different things interact with each other causes a huge paradigm shift with language. So we love language. In this particular case, it's a grammar switch. So when we're dealing with the modernists and when we're dealing with faculty psychology, humans, human thought, human knowledge is the object of our study. Okay, so if we have a short grammar lesson and I say I kicked the ball is the object of my sentence. It's what the action acted upon. And so in acting upon an object, that means that the object has no agency, it has no power, and has no individual thought. Instead, what the existentialists do is they switch the object to the subject. So now the ball is the one that has, in my particular sense, the ball has the agency, the ball has the power. The ball is essentially required as a human to make those decisions, to deal with those decisions, to come up with the questions that they need to ask. So we're putting the focus back on people as individuals and how the individual exists within this much larger social sphere and what that means for individuals and what that means for individual people. So as you focus on the theorists from this particular section, that's what we're really looking at, is what happens when reason and knowledge and thought is the object, and what happens when our freedom and our questioning and our approaches to all of those allow us to take back the power. So Kierkegaard is one of the best for this because he even names his gloom. So it's the grammar and logic of the ordinary mind. So if we have this gloom where it's just, what is the grammar doing? What is the language doing? And then how do all of those two things come together in my head with all of the cultural context that I have around me or the cultural context that I'm paying attention to in this particular situation to generate a question? How do I then generate a question in that particular context in a way that's going to get me transcendent into this higher plane, in this higher realm, in this higher, for Kierkegaard, it's a positive understanding of my subject position and my own power and my relationship to everything here in the world, and then how do I transcend that even further? And so he brings in a very metaphysical, very religious aspect to what happens when we transcend. So it all comes down to, in the connection between all of these existentialists, is the grammar. What do we do with grammar and how do we contextualize it so that we can get to transcendent questions so that we can be a more authentic version of ourselves? So paired with this, we have two composition-focused readings. The first one is Knobloch, who focuses on the idea of writing across the curriculum, or WAC. Writing across the curriculum in WAC, even though Knobloch published this particular piece several years ago, writing across the curriculum is becoming very, very, very important again, and a lot of it has to do with the ideas that she focuses on. So in this case, Knobloch focuses on the idea of writing as grammar, and in her case, it's not the contextualized language grammar that the existentialists are dealing with. It's the rules grammar. So what are comma rules? What are verb rules? How do I have subject-verb agreement in this particular sentence? Versus the idea of writing as knowledge making. And she's looking at it from a writing across the curriculum perspective to say, if a student in biology, and I always pick on biology because it's one of my degrees, if a biologist turns in a paper and all that happens to that particular paper is grammar is addressed, and then the professor who read it said, my students can't write, what Knobloch is asking is the grammar the reason they can't write, or have they not gotten to a point where they're recognizing their writing situation so that they can make knowledge through writing, which is the goal of writing, and it's something that we do with writing. So Knobloch's answer to this is the idea of journaling, especially journaling that's written in class, and it's not graded for content, it's not graded for grammar. Instead, it's graded for completeness, and it provides space to students and time to students and even questions to students so they can start to understand and write through what is knowledge? What is knowledge according to some of these disciplines, and how do I need to understand all of those particular ideas? The next one is Cooper, who again pulls on the idea of writing as process, but her focus is if we focus too heavily on writing as process and we don't incorporate it into the classroom, mixed very heavily with Knobloch's idea that writing is a way of making knowledge, what we're missing and what we're completely forgetting is how we make knowledge with other people and how important making knowledge with other people is. So we instead see the writer as this solitary figure where that's not typically how we write. We do not write in a vacuum. We write to, and again, we're bringing up Bartholomew, and in this case, we're bringing up Brooke, who we're going to talk about in Smith chapter, I think it's 10. What we're focusing on is how does our language operate within a discipline? How is it understood as disciplinary? And what is it that we need to do with that? And so she proposes an ecological model of writing where we are aware of and we acknowledge how important writing is contextually, how important writing is in relation to other people and in relation to everything around us, and how much everything around us helps us figure out what is the writing situation. So Cooper and Bartholomew have very similar points to their particular piece, and Cooper finds the answer is to focus on this idea of the ecological model of writing, where Bartholomew says, let's make students more aware of how to become aware of their writing situations and how to invent the university every time they sit down to write, and how to make that not a struggle, essentially. So Cooper and Bartholomew focus very heavily on very similar ideas. Knobloch and Cooper, again, very similar ideas where we're trying to focus on this idea of process and how do we incorporate it into the classroom, because the problem is theoretically we shifted at this time period from a product focus to a process focus, but that didn't happen across the board in the classroom setting, and some of the assignments that we tried to implement weren't always successful. So how do we have better conversations about how to implement and use assignments to show students how to invent the university every time they sit down? So these are the readings that were covered for week 4. You'll talk about them in both discussion 7 and 8. I'm going to have you guys individually focus on some of the scholars that Smith focuses on, since there's not enough room here to go through them. Make sure you look through the other 2 prezzies that I have specifically on Smith, as I have extensive notes on each of the individual scholars that he lists out. And then I will see you guys in the discussion boards.